Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. There's a particular kind of terror that doesn't announce itself with screams or sirens. It doesn't break down doors in the middle of the night or leave obvious trails of destruction in its wake. This terror wears a familiar face. It sits across from you at the dinner table. It smiles at you in the grocery store. It fills out paperwork in triplicate and waits patiently for approval. This terror exists in the space between what we know and what we're willing to admit we know. It thrives in the gap between warning and action, between concern and intervention, between the moment someone says something feels wrong and the moment anyone decides to listen. We like to believe that danger is detectable, that evil wears a mask we can recognize, that systems exist to catch the warning signs before tragedy unfolds. We tell ourselves that if something truly terrible were about to happen, someone would notice. Someone would sound the alarm. Someone would step in and stop it. We've built entire institutions on this belief, created protocols and procedures, trained professionals to identify risks and neutralize them before they metastasize into something irreversible. We've convinced ourselves that we live in a world where prevention is possible, where vigilance pays off, where the right amount of attention and care can keep the truly awful things at bay. But what happens when every warning exists and no one acts? What happens when the alarm is sounded but the sound is too quiet, too uncertain, too easy to explain away? What happens when the people we trust to keep us safe are too tired, too overwhelmed, too focused on other priorities to notice the danger growing in plain sight? What happens when the systems designed to protect us move too slowly, speak too cautiously, require too much proof before they're willing to intervene? The stories you're about to hear don't begin with monsters. They begin with people who seemed ordinary, people who were trusted, people who existed within the structures of everyday life. They begin with missed calls and filed reports, with concerned neighbors and overworked caseworkers, with bureaucratic delays and jurisdictional confusion. They begin with warnings that were too small to seem urgent, too vague to seem actionable, too uncomfortable to pursue without absolute certainty. They begin with moments when someone could have done something but didn't, not because they were cruel or negligent, but because the moment didn't feel like the right moment, the evidence didn't feel like enough evidence, the concern didn't feel like sufficient justification to disrupt someone's life. These are not stories about failure to see. These are stories about what happens after seeing, in that terrible space where knowledge exists but action doesn't, where everyone knows something is wrong, but no one knows quite what to do about it. These are stories about trust misplaced, oversight overwhelmed, silence maintained, delay compounded, and aftermath endured. These are stories about the cost of waiting just a little bit longer, giving someone just one more chance, assuming the best when evidence suggests otherwise, choosing comfort over confrontation, politeness over prevention. The first thing you need to understand is that none of these stories required hindsight to prevent. Every warning sign that seems obvious now was visible then. Every red flag that feels undeniable in retrospect was present in real time. The difference isn't information. The difference is interpretation, urgency, willingness to act on incomplete certainty. The difference is the decision to believe that this time, things won't escalate. This time, the concern will turn out to be nothing. This time, intervention will prove unnecessary and everyone will be relieved that no one overreacted. Haven Ridge was the kind of town where people knew each other's business but minded their own. It sat in the western part of Pine Valley State, population just under 15,000, small enough that teachers recognized their students' parents in the grocery store, large enough that you could live there for years and still encounter strangers. The houses were modest but well-maintained, the kind of place where lawns got mowed every Saturday and Christmas lights went up the day after Thanksgiving. People worked steady jobs, went to church on Sundays if they were inclined, and generally believed that their town was the sort of place where terrible things happened elsewhere. Caleb Morrell lived on Ashwood Drive in a two-story colonial that looked exactly like every other house on the block. Gray siding, white trim, small front porch with two chairs that rarely got used. His lawn was always cut shorter than necessary, edges crisp, not a dandelion in sight. Neighbors would describe him later as rigid, particular, the kind of man who corrected your grammar mid-conversation and seemed genuinely annoyed when you didn't thank him for it. He worked as an accountant for a regional firm, kept his car meticulously clean, and had opinions about everything from property taxes to the correct way to load a dishwasher. His children were 8 and 6, a boy and a girl whose names would later be scrubbed from most news coverage out of respect for their memory. They attended Haven Ridge Elementary, walked to school most mornings, and were described by teachers as quiet, polite, and somewhat withdrawn. The kind of kids who did their homework and didn't cause trouble, but also didn't raise their hands much or join in playground games with enthusiasm. The kind of kids who seemed fine, who gave no particular cause for concern, who were easy to overlook in a classroom of more demanding personalities. The divorce had been finalized 2 years earlier, a process that dragged on for months and left everyone involved exhausted and bitter. Caleb's ex-wife, whose name also deserves privacy, had moved to another state, a decision that Caleb contested vigorously in court and lost. The custody arrangement gave her primary custody, with Caleb receiving the children every other weekend and alternating holidays. He hated this arrangement with an intensity that surprised even his own lawyer. He spoke about it constantly, framed it as an injustice, described himself as a father being systematically removed from his children's lives by a system biased against men. To hear Caleb tell it, he was the responsible parent, the one who cared about structure and discipline and proper nutrition. His ex-wife was permissive, chaotic, more interested in being their friend than their parent. He had documentation to prove his points, binders full of printed emails and text messages, calendar entries highlighting every time she was 10 minutes late for a pickup or forgot to pack the right jacket. He brought these binders to mediation sessions, presented them like legal evidence, seemed genuinely confused when the mediator suggested that perhaps he was focusing on the wrong things. His coworkers knew him as competent but difficult, the kind of person who would spend 20 minutes explaining why everyone else's method was inefficient before grudgingly helping with a project. He rarely joined them for lunch, never attended happy hours, and seemed to regard small talk as a waste of time that could be better spent organizing spreadsheets. When someone asked how his kids were doing, he would launch into detailed complaints about the custody arrangement rather than actually answering the question. People learned to stop asking. The first report came 16 months before the end. A teacher noticed that Caleb's son had become even quieter than usual, that he flinched when she raised her voice to get the class's attention, that he'd started asking strange questions about whether people could disappear and never be found. She mentioned it to the school counselor, who scheduled a meeting with the boy. He was reluctant to talk at first, then mentioned that his dad had been saying weird things lately, things about how the world was getting worse, and how sometimes the only way to protect people you love is to take them somewhere safe where no one can hurt them. The school counselor documented the conversation, noted that the language seemed concerning but not immediately alarming, and called Caleb to schedule a parent meeting. Caleb arrived with a folder full of counterarguments, ready to explain that his son was simply anxious about the custody situation, that he'd been trying to reassure the boy that no matter what happened with the courts, he would always be there to protect his children. He spoke calmly, rationally, used all the right therapeutic language about emotional security and parental consistency. The counselor felt her concerns ease slightly. Perhaps she'd read too much into a child's garbled retelling of a complicated adult concept. She filed a report anyway, sent it to the county social services office, marked it as low priority, recommended a follow-up check within 60 days. The report went into a queue with 473 other cases. The social worker assigned to intake reviewed it briefly, noted that there was no indication of physical abuse, no immediate safety concern, no allegation of neglect. She tagged it for a routine home visit when someone had time, then moved on to cases involving children who were currently in dangerous situations rather than children who might potentially be in concerning situations. 6 weeks later, Caleb's daughter told her teacher that her dad had been talking about a plan. When the teacher asked what kind of plan, the girl shrugged and said she didn't really understand it, just that it involved going somewhere together where they'd all be happy forever. The teacher felt a chill run through her, but couldn't articulate exactly why. The words themselves weren't threatening. Plenty of parents talked about future plans, about vacations, or moving to a better neighborhood or retirement dreams. But there was something in the way the girl said it, a flatness in her tone that suggested she was repeating words she'd heard many times without fully comprehending their meaning. This teacher also filed a report, this one marked with slightly more urgency, because it was the second concern from the same family. The report reached a different social worker, one who didn't see the previous report in her initial review because the cases had been coded differently in the system. She scheduled a home visit, called Caleb to arrange a time. He was polite on the phone, accommodating, suggested a Saturday morning when the children would be with him, and she could see for herself that everything was fine. The home visit lasted 45 minutes. The house was immaculate, almost aggressively clean, the kind of clean that suggested either professional service or obsessive personal maintenance. The children's rooms were neat, decorated with appropriate toys and books, beds made with hospital corners. The refrigerator was full of healthy food, the pantry organized by category. Caleb answered every question with calm precision, provided documentation of the children's medical records, school attendance, extracurricular activities. He acknowledged that the divorce had been difficult, but insisted he was managing well, that he'd been in therapy, that he understood the importance of maintaining stability for his children. The social worker asked to speak with the children privately. They were polite, quiet, gave short answers to her questions. Did they feel safe? Yes. Did anyone hurt them? No. Were they happy? A pause, then yes. Did their dad ever say or do things that scared them? Another pause, longer this time. The boy looked at his sister. The sister looked at the floor. Then they both shook their heads no. The social worker noted the hesitation, but also noted that children of divorce often struggle with divided loyalties, often feel protective of both parents, often give responses they think adults want to hear. She closed the case with a recommendation that the family continue with therapy and that the school monitor the children's emotional well-being. She genuinely believed she'd made the right call. The home environment was stable. The parent was engaged. The children showed no signs of physical abuse or acute distress. Resources were limited, and there were children in immediate danger who needed those resources more. She moved on to the next case, and the next, and the next, drowning in a caseload that would have required 3 full-time workers to handle adequately. 3 months passed. Caleb's behavior at work became more erratic, though not in ways that raised immediate alarm. He started taking more personal days, calling in sick with increasing frequency. When he was in the office, he seemed distracted, would stare at his computer screen without typing, would startle when someone spoke to him. His supervisor mentioned it in passing, asked if everything was okay at home. Caleb assured him it was, just dealing with some family court issues, nothing to worry about. The supervisor, who had his own problems and his own deadlines, accepted this explanation and returned to his own work. Caleb's ex-wife called the family court judge to request an emergency modification of custody. She'd been talking to the children on their scheduled video calls, and they seemed different, more withdrawn, less willing to talk about what happened during their time with their father. When she asked direct questions, they would glance off camera as if checking whether someone was listening. She couldn't prove anything was wrong, but she knew something was wrong, felt it with the certainty that comes from years of knowing your own children. The judge reviewed the request, noted that there had been 2 school reports, but both had been investigated and closed, noted that there was no current open case with social services, noted that Caleb had been compliant with all court orders and hadn't missed any scheduled custody exchanges. He sympathized with the mother's concerns, but explained that family court couldn't modify custody based on feeling and instinct, that there needed to be documented evidence of changed circumstances that affected the children's welfare. He suggested she document any specific incidents and refile if the situation worsened. She tried. She kept notes of every phone call, every time the children seemed off, every strange comment they made. But children say strange things all the time, and without context, the comments seemed innocuous. Dad says we might go on a long trip soon. Dad says sometimes people have to make hard choices to protect the ones they love. Dad says the world is getting too dangerous. None of it was concrete. All of it could be explained away as a father processing his anxiety about the custody situation, perhaps oversharing with his children, but not actively harming them. Neighbors noticed that Caleb had stopped maintaining his lawn with his usual precision. The grass grew longer, weeds appeared in the flower beds. His car, usually spotless, accumulated dirt and road salt. One neighbor considered mentioning it, then decided it wasn't her business. Another neighbor noticed that Caleb had started closing all his curtains during the day, even the ones facing the backyard where no one could see in any way. He found this odd, but not alarming. People were entitled to privacy. The children's teachers continued to note their increasing withdrawal, but also noted that their grades remained stable. Their behavior remained compliant. In an overcrowded public school system, quiet children who do their work and don't cause disruptions tend to fade into the background. The teachers meant well, but they had 30 other students per class, lesson plans to execute, standardized tests to prepare for. They made notes in the children's files about possible emotional concerns, mentioned it in passing during team meetings, but without a crisis to respond to. The concerns got filed away under monitor and revisit next semester. Caleb's therapist, bound by confidentiality, couldn't share her growing unease with anyone. She'd been seeing him for 8 months. Sessions focused primarily on his anger about the custody arrangement and his belief that the family court system had treated him unfairly. She tried to redirect the conversation toward coping strategies and acceptance, but he seemed stuck in a loop of grievance and resentment. In their most recent session, he'd said something that stuck with her, something about how he'd been thinking about solutions that no one else had considered. When she'd asked him to elaborate, he'd smiled and changed the subject. She'd documented the comment, noted that it could indicate ideation of some kind, but ideation of what exactly? He hadn't threatened anyone. He hadn't mentioned violence or self-harm. He'd simply said he'd been thinking about solutions. She considered breaking confidentiality to file a report, but knew that doing so, without specific evidence of intent to harm, would likely end her therapeutic relationship with him and potentially expose her to liability. She decided to address it more directly in their next session, to assess his mental state more carefully, to determine whether intervention was warranted. That next session never happened. Caleb canceled it 2 days before it was scheduled, left a voicemail saying he wouldn't be needing her services anymore, that he'd figured things out on his own. The therapist felt a spike of concern, but also a sense of professional limitation. She couldn't force a client to continue therapy. She couldn't report someone for canceling appointments. She made a note in his file, closed his case, and hoped that whatever solutions he'd found were healthy ones. The final weekend arrived with no fanfare, no dramatic shift in circumstance, nothing to suggest that this custody exchange would be different from any of the dozens that had preceded it. Caleb picked up his children on Friday afternoon, signed the exchange log that the parents had been required to maintain per court order, loaded their overnight bags into his meticulously clean car. His ex-wife hugged the children goodbye, reminded them to call her before bed, watched them drive away with the usual mix of relief at having a weekend to herself and anxiety that never quite went away when they were with their father. She called Friday night as planned. The children sounded tired but okay, said they'd had pizza for dinner, said they were going to watch a movie before bed. She told them she loved them, reminded them to brush their teeth, ended the call feeling relatively reassured. Saturday morning she texted to check in. Caleb responded that they were having a lazy morning, would probably go to the park later. She sent a heart emoji and went about her day. Sunday morning she called and got no answer. She waited an hour and called again. No answer. She texted. No response. By Sunday afternoon she was actively worried, calling every 30 minutes, sending increasingly urgent messages. By Sunday evening she was calling Caleb's parents, his siblings, anyone who might know where he was. No one had heard from him. She called the police to request a welfare check. The officer who responded knocked on Caleb's door for 5 minutes before trying the handle and finding it unlocked. The house was dark, curtains drawn, silent in a way that immediately felt wrong. He called out, identified himself, moved through the rooms with his hand near his weapon. The living room was empty. The kitchen was empty. He climbed the stairs, calling out again, receiving no response. He found them in the master bedroom, tucked into bed like they were sleeping. Caleb lay in the middle, a child on either side, their small bodies positioned carefully, peacefully, as if he'd wanted their last moments to look like a family at rest. The officer backed out of the room immediately, called for backup and the medical examiner, then stood in the hallway trying not to vomit, trying not to think about his own children asleep in their beds at home. The investigation revealed that Caleb had used prescription medication, crushed into a powder, and mixed into their evening hot chocolate. The dose was calculated with the same precision he'd applied to everything else in his life. enough to ensure unconsciousness quickly, death shortly after. He'd written a letter explaining his reasoning, pages of justification about protecting his children from a world that was becoming too dangerous, from a custody system that was tearing their family apart, from a future where they would be poisoned against him by their mother and her new life. The letter was rational in structure, coherent in grammar, absolutely deranged in content. He'd convinced himself that this was an act of love, that by ensuring they all left together, he was sparing his children from pain and himself from the unbearable reality of watching them grow up without him. He'd planned it for months, researched methods, calculated dosages, chosen a weekend when no one would check on them until it was too late. He'd said goodbye to no one, left no warning, executed his plan with the same meticulous attention to detail he'd brought to his accounting work and his lawn maintenance. The school counselor who'd filed the first report read about it in the local news and felt physically ill. She pulled the file, reread her notes, saw the warning signs she'd documented but not acted on with sufficient urgency. The social worker who'd closed the case after the home visit took a sick day and spent it crying in her bathroom, knowing rationally that she'd followed protocol, but feeling in her bones that protocol had failed. The therapist who'd noted his concerning comment about solutions broke down during her next client session and had to reschedule the rest of her day. Caleb's ex-wife stopped eating, stopped sleeping, replayed every phone call and text message looking for the signs she'd missed, the intervention she should have demanded, the moment she should have known. She filed a lawsuit against the social services department, not because she thought money would help, but because she needed someone to acknowledge that the system had failed, that her children's deaths were preventable, that all the protocols and procedures and documented concerns had amounted to nothing but paperwork gathering dust while her children were murdered by their own father. The lawsuit was eventually settled out of court with no admission of wrongdoing. The Social Services Department released a statement expressing sympathy for the family's loss and reaffirming their commitment to child safety. They conducted an internal review that resulted in minor policy adjustments and a recommendation for increased staffing that was never funded. The school district updated their reporting procedures, added an additional layer of documentation, trained staff on recognizing warning signs of parental mental health crises. But none of it brought the children back. None of it changed the fact that every warning sign had been documented, every concern had been filed, every protocol had been followed, and 2 children were still dead because the system moved too slowly, spoke too cautiously, required too much proof before it was willing to disrupt a parent's life. The system had worked exactly as designed, which meant the system itself was the problem. Caleb Morrell wasn't a monster who appeared out of nowhere. He was a father who loved his children in a way that became toxic, who couldn't accept the reality of his changed circumstances, who retreated into an ideation where death was preferable to loss of control. He was also someone who left a trail of documentation so clear that investigators reviewing the case afterward could see exactly how events would unfold, could identify the specific moments when intervention might have prevented tragedy, could recognize that prevention had been possible right up until the moment it wasn't. The most haunting aspect wasn't the violence itself, but the preventability. Every person who'd interacted with Caleb in those final months had sensed something wrong. Teachers, counselors, social workers, neighbors, co-workers, his own therapist. All of them had felt the unease, documented the concern, passed the information forward. But unease isn't evidence. Concern isn't proof. Documentation isn't intervention. And by the time everyone's individual pieces of information were assembled into a complete picture, the picture was of a crime scene. This is what happens when systems prioritize caution over action, when the burden of proof is set so high that tragedy becomes inevitable. This is what happens when everyone assumes someone else will handle it, when everyone waits for certainty that never arrives until it's too late. This is what happens when we mistake procedure for protection, when we confuse documentation with prevention, when we convince ourselves that following the rules absolves us of responsibility for the outcomes. Brookhaven Heights sat 200 miles east of Haven Ridge, a mid-sized city known for its university and its revitalized downtown district. The kind of place young professionals moved to for affordable housing and decent schools, where old warehouses had been converted into loft apartments and local coffee shops competed with chain stores for foot traffic. It was diverse, progressive, Friendly in that particular way that cities are friendly when most residents are transplants who've chosen to be there rather than people rooted through generations. Elaine Foster and Marcus Lowell had lived together for 6 years in a renovated brownstone on Maple Street. They weren't married, had no particular interest in the institution, but were committed to each other in ways that transcended paperwork. Elaine worked as a grant writer for a nonprofit focused on housing insecurity. Marcus taught high school English and coached the debate team. They were the kind of couple people described as kind, generous, always willing to help. Their home reflected their values. The guest room was never empty, always housing someone in transition. A college student who'd been kicked out by homophobic parents. A woman fleeing an abusive relationship. A formerly incarcerated person trying to rebuild their life. Elaine and Marcus believed in second chances, in the fundamental dignity of all people, in the idea that most people were doing their best with the circumstances they'd been given. They opened their home and their lives to people others had written off. Their friends admired this generosity, but also worried about it. Not everyone in need is safe to invite into your home. Not everyone down on their luck is just unlucky. But Elaine and Marcus would gently push back on these concerns, point out that they were careful, that they had boundaries, that they didn't just let anyone move in without vetting them first. They checked references when possible, had honest conversations about expectations, trusted their instincts about people. Victor Hale entered their lives through a re-entry program Elaine's nonprofit partnered with. He'd served 8 years for aggravated assault, a bar fight that had escalated beyond what he'd intended, or so the story went. He'd been a model prisoner, completed every available rehabilitation program, earned his GED and an associate's degree through correspondence courses. The reentry counselor described him as motivated, remorseful, ready to rebuild his life as a contributing member of society. Victor was in his mid-30s, soft-spoken, with the kind of institutional politeness that comes from years of navigating power dynamics, where any wrong word can extend your sentence. He'd been released 3 weeks earlier with $200 in gate money, no family willing to take him in, no employment prospects beyond minimum wage positions that wouldn't hire him once they ran his background check. He was staying in a shelter downtown, sleeping on a cot surrounded by 60 other men, trying to save enough money for a security deposit on a room somewhere, while also paying for bus fare and work boots and the other invisible costs of trying to restart a life. Elaine met him at a reentry workshop, where she was presenting information about her nonprofit services. He asked thoughtful questions, took detailed notes, thanked her afterward for her time. She was struck by how articulate he was, how genuinely interested he seemed in rebuilding his life properly. When he mentioned his housing situation, she found herself offering their guest room without consulting Marcus first, then immediately texting Marcus to explain and getting his supportive agreement within minutes. Victor moved in the following weekend with everything he owned in a single garbage bag. Clothes, toiletries, the books he'd accumulated in prison. He was overwhelmingly grateful, almost embarrassingly so, thanking them multiple times per day for the first week. He was neat, quiet, respectful of their space and their privacy. He found a job washing dishes at a downtown restaurant, left early each morning and returned late each night, exhausted but determined. For the first 2 months, the arrangement worked beautifully. Victor saved money, started talking about finding his own place soon, brought home leftovers from the restaurant to contribute to meals. Elaine and Marcus congratulated themselves on their good judgment, felt validated in their belief that most people just needed a chance to prove themselves. They introduced Victor to friends, helped him set up a bank account, drove him to appointments with his parole officer. The shift was gradual enough that neither of them could identify exactly when things changed. Victor started coming home later, sometimes smelling of alcohol despite his parole conditions prohibiting drinking. When they gently mentioned this, he became defensive, accused them of treating him like a criminal, reminded them that he'd paid his debt to society. They backed off, not wanting to seem judgmental, not wanting to undermine the trust they'd been building. He lost the dishwashing job, claimed his manager had it out for him, that the guy was looking for any excuse to fire the ex-con. Elaine believed him at first, had seen enough employment discrimination in her work to know it was real and common. She helped him file for unemployment, started asking around for other opportunities. But then Victor started sleeping until noon, spending his days watching television, making no visible effort to find new work. When Marcus suggested he might want to set some job search goals, Victor exploded with sudden rage, shouting that he was doing his best, that not everyone had Marcus's privilege and education, that it was easy to lecture people when you'd never spent a day in prison. Marcus was so shocked by the outburst that he apologized, even though he knew he'd said nothing unreasonable. Victor calmed down quickly, apologized profusely, blamed his medication, promised to do better. Money started disappearing from Elaine's wallet. Small amounts at first, $20 here, $40 there, enough to notice but easy to rationalize away. Maybe she'd spent it and forgotten. Maybe she'd miscounted. She mentioned it to Marcus, who admitted he'd noticed the same thing but hadn't wanted to accuse Victor without proof. They decided to be more careful about leaving cash around, told themselves they were being paranoid, that Victor was probably not stealing from them. Then Elaine's credit card was declined at the grocery store. When she called the bank, she discovered that someone had been using her card number for online purchases, hundreds of dollars charged to gaming sites and electronics retailers. The bank's fraud department asked if anyone else had access to her card. She looked at Marcus. He looked back at her. Neither of them wanted to say what they were both thinking. They confronted Victor that evening, calmly, trying to give him a chance to explain. He denied it immediately, became agitated, accused them of looking for any reason to throw him out, said this was exactly the kind of discrimination he'd been warned about. He was so convincing in his outrage that Elaine started to doubt herself. Maybe someone had skimmed her card at a gas station. Maybe this was unrelated to Victor. But Marcus had already made up his mind. That night, after Victor went to bed, he told Elaine they needed to ask him to leave. It wasn't safe anymore. The anger, the lying, the theft, all of it pointed to someone who wasn't actually in recovery, but was instead manipulating their kindness. Elaine agreed intellectually, but struggled emotionally. What if they were wrong? What if kicking Victor out sent him back to the streets, back to the circumstances that had led to his incarceration in the first place? What if they were part of the problem? People who claimed to believe in second chances, but abandoned people at the first sign of difficulty. They decided to give it one more week, to observe more carefully, to document any concerning behavior before making a final decision. It was a reasonable, cautious approach. It was also a fatal mistake. Victor sensed the shift in their attitude toward him. He'd been reading people's micro-expressions and subtle cues for years, survival skills developed in environments where missing a warning sign could get you hurt. He knew they were planning to kick him out. He knew his time in their comfortable home with their comfortable lives was ending. And he felt the familiar rage building, the same rage that had landed him in prison the first time. The rage he'd learned to manage through therapy and medication, but had never fully eliminated. He started drinking more heavily, hiding bottles in his room, in the garage, anywhere Elaine and Marcus wouldn't immediately find them. He stopped taking his medication, convinced himself he didn't need it, that the only reason he'd ever gotten in trouble was because people pushed him, because people treated him like garbage, because people like Elaine and Marcus pretended to care, but were really just performing charity to make themselves feel superior. The reentry counselor called to check on how Victor was adjusting. Elaine answered the phone, spoke carefully, admitted there had been some challenges, but said they were working through them. The counselor picked up on her hesitation, asked if Victor was following his parole conditions. Elaine paused, torn between honesty and loyalty, between protecting herself and not wanting to send someone back to prison. She said everything was fine, they just needed to set clearer boundaries. The counselor noted something in the call that concerned him, made a note to follow up in person within the next 2 weeks. He had 63 other parolees to monitor, most of them with more obvious warning signs than a vague sense of tension in a housing situation. He prioritized the cases that seemed most urgent, planned to circle back to Victor when time allowed. 3 days before that follow-up visit was scheduled, Marcus stayed late at school for parent-teacher conferences. Elaine came home from work to find Victor in the kitchen, drunk, agitated, pacing. She tried to slip past him to her bedroom, to give him space to calm down, but he blocked her path. He started talking, words tumbling out in an angry stream, about how she and Marcus thought they were so much better than him, how they'd taken him in just to feel good about themselves, how they were planning to throw him out like trash. Elaine tried to de-escalate, speaking calmly, assuring him they weren't throwing him out. They just needed to have a conversation about expectations. But Victor was too far gone, too drunk and too angry to hear reason. When she tried to move past him again, he grabbed her arm. When she pulled away, he pushed her. She fell backward, hitting her head on the corner of the counter. The impact was severe enough to stun her, leaving her dazed on the kitchen floor. Victor stood over her, breathing hard, seeming to realize what he'd done, but unable to stop the momentum of his rage. He'd crossed a line, and some part of him knew that crossing back wasn't possible, that the life he'd been building was over, that he was going back to prison unless he did something to prevent it. Marcus arrived home 40 minutes later to find the front door standing open. He called out for Elaine, received no response, felt his stomach drop with immediate dread. He found her in the kitchen, found Victor in the guest room packing his garbage bag with shaking hands, found evidence of violence that would later be documented by forensic investigators with clinical precision. The 911 call was played at Victor's trial, Marcus's voice breaking as he begged for an ambulance, as he tried to explain what he was seeing, as he realized his partner was gone. Victor was arrested at a bus station 6 hours later, still carrying the garbage bag, still wearing clothes stained with Elaine's blood. He confessed immediately, seemed almost relieved to be back in custody, back in an environment where someone else made all the decisions, and he didn't have to pretend to be rehabilitated anymore. The trial was swift. Victor's public defender argued that he hadn't intended to kill anyone, that he'd panicked after the initial assault, that his years of incarceration had left him unable to handle the stress of reintegration. The prosecutor argued that Victor had always been violent, that the assault that sent him to prison the first time had shown his true nature, that 8 years of good behavior behind bars meant nothing when he was capable of murder within months of release. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Victor was sentenced to life without possibility of parole, returned to the same prison system he'd been released from, this time permanently. At his sentencing, he apologized to Marcus, said he never meant for any of it to happen, said he was sorry. Marcus sat in the courtroom gallery, staring at the man who'd killed his partner, feeling nothing but hollow exhaustion. The reentry program conducted an internal review, identified several points where earlier intervention might have prevented the tragedy. Victor's parole officer should have conducted more frequent home visits. The reentry counselor should have followed up on his sense that something was wrong during the phone call with Elaine. The program should have had better protocols for monitoring parolees' mental health and substance use during the critical early months of reintegration. But these realizations came too late for Elaine, who believed in the possibility of redemption and paid for that belief with her life. Too late for Marcus, who'd supported his partner's generosity and now lived alone in a house full of memories he couldn't escape. Too late for all the other well-meaning people who opened their homes to strangers in need and would now question whether their kindness was naive, whether their faith in humanity was dangerous, whether they should close their doors and protect themselves rather than risk becoming the next tragedy. The story sparked fierce debate in Brookhaven Heights. Some people argued that Elaine and Marcus had been reckless, that inviting a convicted violent offender into your home was foolish no matter how reformed he seemed. Others argued that society had failed Victor, that releasing people from prison without adequate support systems and expecting them to successfully reintegrate was setting them up to fail. Both perspectives contained truth. Neither provided comfort. What got lost in the debate was the fundamental question of warning signs and response. Elaine had known something was wrong. She'd noticed the drinking, the theft, the sudden rage. She'd been troubled enough to mention it to the reentry counselor. But she'd also been caught between competing values, between her genuine desire to help and her growing awareness that help might not be possible, between not wanting to give up on someone and not wanting to put herself at risk. This is the terrible calculus that kind people are forced to make every day. How much benefit of the doubt is too much? At what point does compassion become complicity in your own harm? When do you stop believing someone's promises to change and accept that change might not be occurring? These questions don't have clear answers, which is exactly why people like Elaine hesitate. Give second chances. Wait just a little longer before taking action that feels harsh or judgmental. The reentry counselor quit his job 6 months after Elaine's death, unable to continue working in a system he'd come to see as fundamentally broken. The nonprofit Elaine worked for established a fund in her name to support housing security for people leaving incarceration, a tribute to her values that also felt like an acknowledgement that those values had gotten her killed. Marcus eventually sold the house and moved to another city, unable to live in the space where his partner had died while he was grading essays and discussing college applications with teenagers. Victor's parole officer received a formal reprimand for inadequate supervision but kept his job, kept monitoring other parolees, kept making the same impossible calculations about who needed closer watch and who seemed stable enough to require less intensive oversight. He had a caseload of 97 people, a job that required at least 40 hours per week per person if done properly, and exactly 40 hours total available in his work week. He did the math and understood that failure was inevitable, that eventually someone on his caseload would commit a serious crime, and he would have to live with knowing he'd been responsible for their supervision. This is what underfunded social services looks like in practice. Not abstract policy debates, but concrete tragedies, real people dead, because there aren't enough social workers, or parole officers, or reentry counselors, or mental health professionals to adequately monitor and support the people who need monitoring and support. The system lurches from crisis to crisis, responding to acute emergencies while chronic risks accumulate, until one of those chronic risks becomes the next emergency, and everyone looks back at the warning signs that were obvious but unaddressed. Riverbend County sprawled across the southern part of the state, rural and economically depressed, the kind of place where mines had closed decades ago, and nothing had replaced them but dollar stores and despair. Small towns scattered across the landscape, connected by two-lane highways and separated by miles of farmland and forest. It was the kind of county where everyone knew everyone's business in theory, but where people also maintained a fierce privacy, where asking too many questions could get you labeled as nosy, where minding your own business was considered a virtue. Darren Cole grew up in this environment, fifth of 6 children in a family that barely had enough money for groceries, let alone supervision. His father worked irregular construction jobs and drank away most of what he earned. His mother cleaned houses for wealthier families in the county seat, came home exhausted, had no energy left for parenting beyond making sure everyone got fed. Darren learned early how to be invisible, how to avoid his father's attention when the man was drunk and mean, how to take what he wanted when no one was watching. His first arrest came at 16, shoplifting beer from a gas station. The judge gave him probation and a stern lecture about making better choices. His second arrest came at 18, assault after a fight outside a bar. He served 6 months in county jail, got released with instructions to complete anger management classes that he attended twice before stopping. His third arrest came at 21, and this time it wasn't a bar fight or petty theft. This time it was murder. The victim was his girlfriend, a 19-year-old woman named Amy who'd been trying to break up with him for weeks. Darren couldn't accept the rejection, couldn't handle the loss of control. He'd shown up at her apartment drunk and angry, demanding she give him another chance. When she'd refused, when she'd told him to leave or she'd call the police, something in him had snapped. The crime scene suggested he'd beaten her for an extended period, that she'd tried to fight back, that she'd eventually stopped moving, and he'd kept going anyway. He was arrested the next morning, still in the same clothes, blood still under his fingernails. He confessed to the crime, but claimed it was a crime of passion, said he'd loved Amy and couldn't stand the thought of losing her, said he'd never meant to hurt her that badly. His public defender built a case around his troubled childhood, his lack of positive role models, his untreated mental health issues. The prosecutor argued for first-degree murder, premeditation evidenced by the fact that Darren had driven to Amy's apartment with the deliberate intention of confronting her. The jury compromised on second-degree murder, accepting that Darren probably hadn't planned to kill Amy when he'd arrived, but rejecting his claims that the violence was somehow accidental or uncontrollable. He was sentenced to 25 years to life, sent to state prison, expected to serve at least 15 years before being eligible for parole. Inside, Darren became a student of the system. He watched other inmates, noted which behaviors got rewarded and which got punished, learned how to present himself as reformed without actually changing anything fundamental about who he was. He attended every available program, anger management and substance abuse treatment, and victim impact panels. He learned the language of accountability and remorse, practiced delivering apologies that sounded sincere, memorized the right answers to give psychological evaluators. He was a model prisoner on paper, never wrote up for disciplinary infractions, always polite to guards, helpful to other inmates in ways that made him seem like a positive influence. The prison psychologists noted his progress, documented his participation in programs, wrote evaluations suggesting he'd done significant work to address the issues that had led to his crime. They acknowledged that he'd killed someone, but also believed that 15 years was a long time, that people could change, that the purpose of incarceration was supposed to be rehabilitation, not just punishment. When Darren came up for his first parole hearing at the 15-year mark, he'd prepared thoroughly. He'd written letters to Amy's family expressing his remorse, written essays about what he'd learned about himself and about violence against women, obtained certificates from every program he'd completed. He spoke eloquently about his crime, acknowledging what he'd done without making excuses, explaining the work he'd done to understand his anger and control it. The parole board was impressed. They asked tough questions, and he gave thoughtful answers. They pushed back on his claims of remorse, and he didn't get defensive, instead acknowledging that he understood their skepticism and explaining what he could point to as evidence of genuine change. They noted that he'd served 15 years without incident, that his psychological evaluations were positive, that he had a solid reentry plan including job prospects and housing arranged through a halfway house. Amy's family attended the hearing and begged the board not to release him. Her mother spoke about the daughter she'd lost, about the grandchildren she'd never have, about the hole in her life that 15 years hadn't come close to filling. She said Darren was a manipulator, that his remorse was performance, that he'd killed Amy because he couldn't control her and would kill again if given the opportunity. But grief doesn't constitute evidence, and the parole system isn't designed to keep people imprisoned indefinitely based on victims' families' fears. The board voted to grant parole with the standard conditions: regular check-ins with a parole officer, residence at an approved address, no contact with Amy's family, completion of ongoing counseling. Darren left prison after 15 years and 4 months, walked out into a world that had changed dramatically since he'd entered, equipped with his certificates and his practiced remorse and his deep understanding of how to game the system. The halfway house was in a different county, 3 hours from where he'd grown up and where Amy's family still lived. He moved into a shared room, followed all the rules, attended his required counseling sessions, met with his parole officer every week as scheduled. He got a job at a warehouse, worked night shifts loading trucks, kept to himself, and gave no one any reason for concern. 6 months into his parole, he moved out of the halfway house and into his own apartment, a development his parole officer approved after confirming the address and verifying Darren's employment. He reduced the check-ins to twice monthly, standard procedure for parolees who were demonstrating stability. Darren continued to say all the right things, show up where he was supposed to show up, present himself as someone successfully reintegrating into society. Then women started disappearing. Not all at once, not in ways that immediately seemed connected. A 23-year-old waitress last seen leaving her shift at a truck stop diner. A 19-year-old college student who never made it home from a party. A 31-year-old mother of 2 who vanished from a grocery store parking lot. They disappeared from different towns across a 3-county area over the course of 18 months. And because they were reported to different police departments with different record-keeping systems and different investigative priorities, no one connected the cases. The waitress was assumed to have run off with a boyfriend, known to be unreliable, from a family that had filed missing person reports on her before. The college student was initially treated as a possible runaway. Young women often drop out and disappear, especially ones with the kind of anxiety issues her roommate mentioned. The mother of 2 was taken more seriously, but the investigation stalled quickly. No witnesses, no surveillance footage, no evidence beyond an abandoned car. Darren's parole officer never knew about any of these disappearances because none of them occurred in his jurisdiction, and there was no reason for him to be monitoring missing persons reports from other counties. Darren continued to appear at their scheduled meetings, continued to maintain his employment, continued to live at his approved address. On paper, he was a success story, a violent offender who'd done his time and turned his life around. The woman who would eventually lead to his arrest was different. She was reported missing immediately by her husband, a well-connected attorney who had the resources and connections to push for a serious investigation. When she disappeared from a mall parking lot in broad daylight, multiple agencies got involved quickly. Surveillance footage showed a man approaching her vehicle, showed what looked like a brief conversation, showed her getting into a pickup truck with him. The footage was grainy but clear enough to identify the vehicle make and model. Detectives canvassed the area looking for trucks matching the description, eventually found one registered to Darren Cole. They ran his name and discovered the murder conviction, the recent parole. They brought him in for questioning and he maintained his composure beautifully, expressed concern for the missing woman, explained that he'd been at work at the time she disappeared, provided what seemed like a solid alibi. But the detective interviewing him had an instinct honed by 20 years of listening to people lie. Something about Darren's performance felt off, too smooth, too prepared. He pushed harder, started asking about the other missing women, watched Darren's micro-expressions as he claimed to know nothing about them. He saw the flash of something behind Darren's eyes, there and gone in an instant, but enough to convince him they had the right person. They got a warrant to search Darren's apartment and vehicle. In his truck, they found traces of blood that DNA analysis would later match to the attorney's wife. In his apartment, they found journals documenting his movements, notes about women he'd observed, details that matched the missing women's last known locations. They found Amy's photograph, the girlfriend he'd murdered 15 years earlier, tucked into one of the journals like a trophy. The journals revealed that Darren had never actually reformed, had never actually felt remorse for killing Amy. He'd simply learned how to hide his true nature, how to perform rehabilitation while planning his next victims. He'd used his time in prison to refine his approach, to study mistakes he'd made with Amy, to develop better methods for selecting and acquiring targets. The certificates and the counseling and the parole board testimony had all been carefully constructed performance, and everyone had believed it. Amy's mother heard about the arrest on the news and felt a complex mixture of vindication and rage. She'd known, had told the parole board exactly what would happen, and they'd released him anyway. How many women had died because the system valued his claims of reformation over her warnings? How many families were now living with the same grief she'd carried for 15 years? The detective who'd pushed for the warrant worked with other jurisdictions to connect Darren to the missing women. DNA evidence eventually linked him to 3 of them. The others remained unsolved, bodies never recovered, families left without closure. Darren refused to cooperate, maintained his innocence despite overwhelming evidence, seemed to enjoy the attention and the perception of himself as a criminal mastermind rather than what he actually was, a violent misogynist who'd learned to weaponize the language of rehabilitation. His trial became a referendum on the parole system itself. Prosecutors argued that violent offenders who kill intimate partners should never be released because the psychology that enables that violence doesn't fundamentally change. Defense attorneys argued that the criminal justice system is supposed to allow for redemption, that keeping everyone imprisoned forever isn't justice. The jury convicted Darren on all counts, and he was sentenced to multiple life terms without possibility of parole, returning to the same prison he'd been released from, this time permanently. The parole board members who'd voted to release him faced intense public scrutiny. They defended their decision by pointing to his institutional record, his psychological evaluations, the protocols they'd followed. They weren't wrong to follow those protocols, but the protocols themselves were revealed as fundamentally inadequate for assessing genuine versus performed rehabilitation. Darren had proven that a sufficiently motivated and intelligent person could game the entire system, could say and do everything required to earn release while remaining fundamentally dangerous. This created an impossible dilemma. If the system becomes so restrictive that no one who commits a violent crime can ever earn parole, then parole becomes meaningless and sentences become de facto life imprisonment. But if the system can be manipulated by people who are good at performing remorse, then releasing anyone becomes a gamble with public safety. There's no clear answer, no protocol that can reliably distinguish between genuine change and sophisticated deception. The parole officer who'd supervised Darren took early retirement, unable to continue in a job where he'd always be second-guessing his own judgment, wondering if the parolee sitting across from him telling him about their progress was being genuine or was performing. The prison psychologists who'd written positive evaluations for Darren faced professional consequences, their judgment questioned, their methods criticized. They'd done their jobs according to their training, assessed Darren based on observable behavior and measurable progress, and it had all been meaningless because Darren had understood exactly what they were looking for and had given it to them. The halfway house where Darren had spent his first 6 months post-release implemented new screening protocols, more intensive monitoring, more frequent check-ins. But they also acknowledged that determined manipulators will always find ways around any system, that there's no amount of supervision that can prevent someone from eventually committing violence if they're motivated enough and patient enough. What haunted everyone involved was the preventability. If the parole board had listened to Amy's family, if they'd weighted victim impact more heavily than institutional behavior, Darren would still be in prison and the women he killed would still be alive. But victim impact isn't supposed to be the determining factor in parole decisions because it's not objective, because grief-stricken families will always want maximum punishment regardless of evidence of rehabilitation. The system tried to balance multiple factors and made the wrong call, and people died because of it. This is what happens when systems prioritize process over outcomes, when following protocols becomes more important than protecting public safety, when faith in rehabilitation overrides evidence that some people are fundamentally irredeemable. The warnings were there in Amy's mother's testimony, in the nature of Darren's original crime, in the basic understanding that someone who murders their intimate partner over a breakup has demonstrated a level of narcissism and need for control that doesn't disappear through anger management classes. Red Ash Crossing was an industrial city that had seen better days, factory towns where the factories had mostly closed, leaving behind empty buildings and stubborn residents who couldn't afford to leave. The population had declined by 30% over 2 decades, young people moving away for opportunities that didn't exist locally, older residents aging in place in houses that had lost most of their value. It was the kind of city where abandoned properties outnumbered occupied ones in some neighborhoods, where streetlights stayed broken for months because the city couldn't afford to fix them. Bodies started appearing in these abandoned properties, discovered by urban explorers and squatters, and occasionally by police conducting sweeps. The first was found in the basement of a shuttered textile mill, partially decomposed, missing several limbs. The medical examiner determined the dismemberment had occurred post-mortem, that the victim had been dead for at least 6 weeks before the body parts were separated. The second body was found 3 months later in an abandoned warehouse, in similar condition. Then a third, a fourth, a fifth. All were women in their 20s and 30s. All had been dismembered after death. All had been dead for weeks or months before discovery. The police formed a task force, recognizing they had a serial killer operating in their city, someone methodical and patient and getting away with it. The media coverage was intense and speculative, reporters throwing around theories about satanic rituals and organ harvesting and other sensational explanations that had no basis in evidence. The reality was actually stranger and more disturbing than any of the media speculation. But that reality wouldn't become clear until Elias Crow was finally identified and arrested. Elias had lived in Red Ash Crossing his entire life, 43 years in the same neighborhood where he'd grown up, working the same kinds of industrial jobs his father had worked before the factories closed. He'd been laid off 5 years earlier when the plant where he'd worked for 2 decades shut down, had never found comparable employment, had slowly descended into isolation and poverty. He lived alone in a small house his parents had left him, rarely interacted with neighbors, gave no outward sign of being anything other than another casualty of economic decline. But Elias had developed a complex internal belief system over years of isolation, a worldview where he saw himself as engaged in a kind of sacred work. He'd been consuming extremist content online, had gravitated toward ideologies that framed women as inferior, had convinced himself that he was performing a necessary function by removing certain types of women from society. The dismemberment wasn't random violence, but part of an elaborate ritual he'd created, imbued with meaning that made sense only within his distorted framework. He'd also engaged in cannibalism, consuming parts of his victims in acts he viewed as achieving dominance and control. This aspect of his crimes was carefully concealed from the media initially, law enforcement not wanting to release details that would inspire copycats or traumatize victims' families unnecessarily. But it came out during the trial, testimony from forensic pathologists about teeth marks on bones, testimony from investigators who'd found cooking implements in Elias's house with human DNA. The investigation that led to Elias took months of painstaking work. Unlike Darren Cole, who'd left clear patterns once investigators knew to look for them, Elias had been careful about not creating obvious connections between victims. He'd selected women from different neighborhoods, different demographics, different social circles. He'd varied his methods of initial contact, sometimes approaching women who appeared vulnerable or intoxicated, sometimes breaking into homes, sometimes using online platforms to arrange meetings under false pretenses. What finally connected him to the crimes was DNA. Skin cells found under one victim's fingernails, blood trace on another victim's clothing, biological evidence that suggested she'd fought back hard enough to injure her attacker. The DNA went into databases and initially yielded no matches. But then a distant relative of Elias submitted DNA to a genealogy website, one of those services people use to trace their ancestry and connect with unknown relatives. Law enforcement had recently started using these genealogy databases to solve cold cases, building family trees from DNA matches and working backward to identify potential suspects. When Elias's DNA from the crime scenes was run through these databases, it matched the distant relative closely enough to suggest they shared a common ancestor. Investigators built out the family tree, identified Elias as a potential match, began surveillance. They watched him for weeks, looking for probable cause to obtain his DNA directly. They finally got it when he discarded a coffee cup at a public park. The DNA from the cup matched the DNA from the crime scenes. They arrested him the same day, searched his property, found a soundproofed room in his basement containing tools and equipment whose purpose was immediately clear and deeply disturbing. Elias confessed to all 5 murders and to 3 others whose bodies hadn't been found. He showed investigators where he disposed of remains in remote areas outside the city, led them to sites that yielded bones and clothing fragments. He was eerily calm during these confessions, spoke about his victims in detached clinical terms, seemed to view the entire process as simply explaining his work to people who lacked the framework to understand it properly. His trial revealed the full scope of his belief system. Journals and online posts documenting years of increasingly violent ideation, plans for future victims, detailed notes about how to avoid detection. Unlike Darren Cole, who'd performed remorse, Elias showed no remorse at all. He maintained that what he'd done had meaning and purpose within his worldview, that he'd been engaged in something important that others simply couldn't comprehend. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Elias was sentenced to 8 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. At his sentencing, he declined to make a statement, simply nodded when the judge read his sentence, was let out of the courtroom with the same detached calm he displayed throughout the trial. The families of his victims struggled with the fact that understanding him was impossible. Some killers can be explained through childhood trauma or mental illness or substance abuse, factors that don't excuse their actions, but at least provide some framework for comprehension. Elias's motivations remained opaque even after extensive testimony and investigation. He'd constructed a belief system so divorced from shared reality that attempting to understand it felt futile. The contrast between Elias's case and the earlier stories is instructive. With Caleb Morell, warnings were filed and ignored because the system moved too slowly. With Victor Hale, warning signs were noticed but dismissed because people wanted to believe in redemption. With Darren Cole, warnings were discounted because he was good at performing rehabilitation. But with Elias Crow, there were no warnings because he'd never been on anyone's radar, had no criminal history, no documented mental health crises, no concerning reports to social services or law enforcement. This is the other side of the prevention paradox. Sometimes people slip through every net because they've never given anyone reason to deploy those nets. Elias had lived a quiet, isolated life that raised no red flags because isolation isn't illegal and being strange isn't a crime. He'd radicalized himself privately, consuming content that's protected by free speech laws, developing beliefs that are abhorrent but not actionable until they manifest in violence. The women he killed had no connection to each other beyond their gender and their geographic proximity. They weren't targeted because of anything they'd done or any relationship they'd had with Elias. They were simply available, vulnerable in moments when he was hunting, unlucky enough to cross paths with someone whose internal world had become completely detached from any normal moral framework. Law enforcement's use of genealogy databases to identify Elias sparked intense debate about privacy and government surveillance. Civil liberties advocates argued that people who submit DNA to ancestry services never consented to having that information used in criminal investigations. Law enforcement argued that solving murders and preventing future killings justified the use of any legal tool available. The courts would eventually rule on the constitutionality of these methods, but by the time those rulings came down, Elias was already imprisoned and the technique had been used to solve dozens of cold cases. The families were left with questions that had no satisfying answers. Why their daughters, their sisters, their mothers? What had Elias seen in them that made them targets? The truth was there was no meaningful answer, that Elias's victim selection was largely opportunistic, that any woman in the wrong place at the wrong time could have ended up in his basement. This randomness was somehow more disturbing than if there had been a pattern, because it meant there was nothing anyone could have done differently, no precaution that would have guaranteed safety. The city of Red Ash Crossing was left grappling with the knowledge that someone had been killing women in their community for years, and no one had noticed. No one had connected the cases. No one had realized they had a serial killer operating in their midst. The police chief faced calls for resignation, accused of incompetence and negligence. He defended his department by pointing out that limited resources meant they'd been focused on solving individual cases rather than looking for patterns across cases, that jurisdictional divides meant they hadn't been sharing information effectively with neighboring departments. This was the same problem that had allowed Darren Cole to kill across county lines without detection. Police departments operate independently, maintain separate databases, have different reporting systems. A pattern that's obvious when all the cases are viewed together remains invisible when each department is only aware of its own cases. Efforts to create better information sharing and data integration had been discussed for years, but never adequately funded or implemented. After Elias's arrest, the state finally allocated money for a centralized database system that would allow different jurisdictions to flag and track similar crimes, to identify patterns that individual departments might miss. This was progress, but it was progress purchased with the lives of women who died while the system remained fragmented. Every improvement to the system seems to come in response to a tragedy rather than in anticipation of one, reactive rather than proactive, too late for the victims who demonstrated the necessity. St. Alderwood Infirmary sat on the edge of town, a long-term care facility that had been serving the community for 40 years. It wasn't fancy, didn't have the amenities of the newer assisted living complexes that had sprung up in the suburbs, but it had a reputation for competent care and compassionate staff. Families placed their elderly relatives there with reasonable confidence that they'd be looked after in their final years, that they'd receive adequate medical attention, that they'd be treated with dignity. Maribel Quince had worked as a nurse at St. Alderwood for 12 years, hired straight out of nursing school, promoted to senior nurse after demonstrating reliability and skill. She was known among families as warm and attentive, the kind of nurse who remembered patients' preferences, who took time to chat with them about their lives, who seemed genuinely invested in their well-being. When families had a choice of shifts, many requested that their relatives be assigned to the wing where Maribel worked, believing their loved ones would receive better care under her supervision. What no one knew was that Maribel had been killing patients for most of her tenure at St. Alderwood, injecting them with lethal doses of medication, smothering them with pillows, sometimes simply withholding necessary treatment until their conditions deteriorated fatally. She was careful about her selection, targeting patients who were already very ill, whose deaths wouldn't seem suspicious, whose families wouldn't question an outcome that seemed inevitable given the patient's condition. The death rate on Maribel's wing was slightly higher than on other wings, but not dramatically so. St. Alderwood served a very ill and very elderly population, deaths were common, and small statistical variations seemed consistent with random chance. When administrators noticed the discrepancy at all, they attributed it to the fact that the sickest patients tended to be assigned to the wing with the most experienced nurses, and Maribel was among the most experienced. She'd started killing for reasons she would later struggle to articulate coherently. In her initial confession, she claimed she'd been motivated by mercy, that she was ending the suffering of people who were dying slowly and painfully. But as investigators dug deeper, They found evidence that suggested her motivations were more complex and more disturbing than simple mercy killing. She'd kept notes about her victims, recorded their final moments in detail, written about the sense of power she felt when deciding who would live and who would die. The pattern might never have been discovered if not for one administrator who'd recently been promoted into a role that involved reviewing patient outcomes across all departments. She was young, new to healthcare administration, approaching the data with fresh eyes, unconditioned by years of accepting certain baseline assumptions. When she ran the numbers on mortality rates by nursing staff, she noticed that Maribel's patients died at a rate significantly higher than would be expected, even accounting for severity of illness. She brought her findings to her supervisor, expecting to be told there was a reasonable explanation she was missing. Instead, her supervisor looked at the data and felt his stomach drop. He'd been in healthcare administration for 30 years and had heard the stories about nurses and doctors who kill, had always assumed it was vanishingly rare, something that happened in other facilities to other administrators. He reviewed the data himself, confirmed what his subordinate had found, then did what protocol required and what his instincts resisted. He called law enforcement. The investigation was conducted quietly initially, law enforcement not wanting to alert Maribel while they gathered evidence. They obtained patient records, interviewed family members about their relatives' final days, consulted with medical experts about whether the recorded causes of death were consistent with the patient's documented conditions. They found irregularities, unexplained medication dosages, documentation gaps that suggested records had been altered. They brought Maribel in for questioning under the pretext of needing her assistance with a routine investigation into a patient's death. She was calm initially, answered questions about her procedures and practices, described herself as someone who took her responsibility to patients very seriously. But as the questions became more pointed, as the detective started asking about specific patients who died under her care, she began to crack. The confession came suddenly, almost as if she'd been waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions. She admitted to killing 37 patients over 11 years, described her methods in clinical detail, explained how she'd hidden the murders by selecting vulnerable patients and timing the deaths to seem natural. She cried as she confessed, but the tears seemed performative, as if she was displaying the emotion she knew was expected rather than feeling genuine remorse. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Families who'd trusted Maribel with their loved one's care were forced to confront the possibility that their relatives hadn't died naturally, that the warm and caring nurse they'd thanked and tipped and invited to funerals had actually murdered the people they'd entrusted to her. Some families requested exhumations and autopsies, desperate for certainty about whether their loved one had been one of Maribel's victims. Many others chose not to know, decided that having their grief reopened and complicated by investigations wasn't worth the pain. The trial revealed the full scope of Maribel's crimes and the systematic failure of oversight that had allowed her to kill for so long. St. Alderwood's internal safety protocols were revealed as largely performative. Policies existed on paper, but weren't consistently enforced in practice. Medication logs were supposed to be double-checked, but often weren't. Patient deaths were supposed to be reviewed by a committee, but the reviews were cursory, focused on paperwork compliance rather than substantive assessment of whether the death was medically appropriate. The state health department launched an investigation into St. Alderwood and into long-term care facilities statewide, looking for similar patterns of elevated mortality that might indicate other healthcare serial killers. They found several facilities with concerning statistics, though subsequent investigations didn't reveal criminal activity, just understaffing and inadequate care that led to preventable deaths through neglect rather than deliberate killing. Maribel was convicted on 37 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. At her sentencing, several family members gave impact statements, describing their loved ones and the trust they'd placed in Maribel and the betrayal they felt upon learning how that trust had been violated. Maribel listened impassively, offered no explanation beyond what she'd already provided, seemed resigned to her fate. The psychological evaluation conducted as part of her trial revealed a complex personality disorder, a woman who craved control and significance, who'd found both in her role as a nurse with power over life and death. She'd started her career with genuine intentions to help people, but had gradually discovered that she derived satisfaction from the act of killing, from the intimacy of being present at the moment of death, from the secret knowledge that she'd caused outcomes that everyone else accepted as natural. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of healthcare serial killers. They operate within systems built on trust, exploit that trust to commit crimes that are almost impossible to detect without statistical analysis that most facilities don't conduct. Patients and families are conditioned to trust medical professionals, to believe that nurses and doctors are motivated by a desire to heal, to assume that deaths in healthcare settings are the result of illness rather than intentional harm. The reforms implemented after Maribel's conviction included mandatory independent review of patient deaths, better tracking of medication usage, protocols requiring multiple staff members to sign off on certain procedures. These reforms were necessary, but they also represented acknowledgement that the previous system had failed catastrophically, that dozens of people had died preventable deaths because oversight was inadequate and trust was assumed rather than verified. The nurses who'd worked alongside Maribel for years struggled with guilt and confusion. Some had noticed small things, irregularities in her behavior, or unexplained coincidences around patient deaths, but had dismissed their concerns as paranoid or had assumed there were explanations they didn't understand. They were forced to confront the reality that their colleague had been a serial killer and they'd seen pieces of evidence, but hadn't assembled them into recognition. This is the terrible burden of hindsight, seeing all the small warning signs that make perfect sense in retrospect, but were easy to explain away in the moment. A patient who'd seemed stable suddenly coding when Maribel was on shift. Medication counts that didn't quite add up. Families who'd seemed surprised by how quickly their relatives had declined. None of it was definitive. All of it could be explained by factors other than intentional killing, but taken together it formed a pattern that no one recognized until it was far too late. The families of Maribel's victims filed a class action lawsuit against St. Alderwood, arguing that the facility's inadequate oversight had enabled the murders. The facility settled for an undisclosed amount, made no admission of wrongdoing, released a statement expressing sympathy for the family's loss and commitment to ensuring nothing like this could happen again. The statement was written by lawyers and approved by insurance companies and contained no genuine accountability, just the careful language of liability management. Several families chose not to join the lawsuit, wanted nothing to do with the legal process, just wanted to try to move forward with their grief. But moving forward was complicated by the knowledge that their loved one's death hadn't been natural, that the person they'd trusted to provide care had instead provided murder, that the peaceful death they'd been told about might have actually been frightening and painful. The violation of trust extended beyond the act of killing to the lies that had surrounded it, the performance of compassion that had masked contempt. The nursing board revoked Maribel's license, conducted reviews of her nursing school training and her employment history, looking for warning signs that might have predicted her behavior. They found nothing definitive, just a competent student who'd become a competent nurse who'd also been a serial killer. This was perhaps most disturbing of all, the realization that there might not be any reliable way to screen for people capable of this kind of sustained deception and violence. Healthcare facilities across the state implemented new screening procedures for employees, more intensive background checks, psychological evaluations, reference checks that went deeper than the standard verification of employment dates. But everyone involved acknowledged that these measures were imperfect, that someone determined to kill patients and skilled at hiding their nature would likely still find ways to do so. The goal was to make it harder, to create more barriers and more oversight, but perfection wasn't possible and everyone knew it. The detective who'd led the investigation against Maribel found himself thinking about all the other nursing homes and hospitals in his jurisdiction, wondering how many more healthcare workers might be killing patients without detection. The statistical analysis that had flagged Maribel had been conducted almost by accident, the result of one administrator's fresh perspective rather than any systematic monitoring. He pushed for his department to conduct similar analysis across all healthcare facilities, but the resources required were enormous, and the political will to fund such an initiative didn't exist. This is the fundamental problem with prevention in systems where the baseline includes death. In nursing homes and hospitals, people die regularly as an expected outcome of their medical conditions. This makes it incredibly difficult to distinguish between natural deaths and murders disguised as natural deaths without intensive investigation of each case, an approach that's not practically feasible given resource constraints. The system relies heavily on trust and on the assumption that healthcare workers are acting in good faith, and when that assumption proves false, the consequences can be catastrophic. If you've made it this far into this video, take a moment to like it and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment letting me know what you think about these stories and which one affected you most. Your engagement helps this channel grow and allows me to keep bringing you these important true crime stories. The question that haunted everyone involved in these cases was the same question. What happens when every warning exists yet no one acts? What happens when systems designed to protect people move too slowly, require too much proof, prioritize process over outcome? What happens when good people see concerning signs but dismiss them, rationalize them, wait for more certainty before taking action that might seem presumptuous or intrusive? Each of these 5 stories represents a different failure mode, a different way that prevention breaks down despite warnings being present. Caleb Morell's case was a failure of bureaucratic speed and coordination, reports filed but not acted on quickly enough, concerns documented but not synthesized into intervention. Victor Hale's case was a failure of risk assessment and monitoring, a violent offender released because he performed rehabilitation convincingly, then inadequately supervised during his reintegration. Darren Cole's case was a failure of the parole system's ability to distinguish genuine change from sophisticated manipulation, a man who learned to game every assessment and interview, who studied the language of remorse without actually feeling it. Elias Crow's case was different, a failure that occurred because he'd never been on anyone's radar, had no criminal history or documented concerns that would have triggered investigation before he started killing. Maribel Quince's case was a failure of oversight in a system built on trust, a healthcare environment where deaths were expected and therefore not scrutinized, where statistical anomalies went unnoticed for years because no one was looking for patterns. Different failure modes, but the same underlying problem. Systems that react to crises but don't prevent them, that document warnings but don't act on them with sufficient urgency, that prioritize individual rights and procedural correctness over collective safety. The people who lived through these tragedies, the survivors and family members and professionals who'd missed the warning signs, were left with a particular kind of guilt that's almost impossible to process. They hadn't done anything wrong by conventional standards. They'd followed protocols, made reasonable decisions based on available information, acted within the scope of their authority and responsibility. But reasonable decisions had led to unreasonable outcomes, and the gap between following the rules and preventing tragedy was a chasm they'd have to live with forever. The school counselor who'd filed the first report on Caleb Morell's concerning behavior never returned to school counseling, moved into a different field entirely, unable to continue in a role where she'd always be wondering whether she was missing the next warning sign. The social worker who'd closed Victor Hale's case after the home visit continued in her job, but became more aggressive in her interventions, erring on the side of overreaction rather than underreaction, accumulating complaints from parents who felt she was being intrusive and overcautious. The parole board members who'd voted to release Darren Cole faced professional and personal consequences, some resigning under pressure, others becoming so risk-averse in subsequent hearings that they effectively stopped granting parole to anyone with a violent history. The administrator who'd flagged Maribel Quince's elevated mortality rate was praised for her diligence, but also found herself isolated professionally, seen by some colleagues as someone who'd brought unwanted scrutiny and negative attention to the field. These are the people who did everything right and still ended up entangled in tragedy, who followed their training and their instincts and their protocols and discovered that none of it was enough. They represent the impossible position that frontline workers occupy in underfunded and overwhelmed systems, expected to prevent tragedies with inadequate resources and impossible caseloads, blamed when prevention fails, but rarely supported when it succeeds. Because prevention is invisible by definition. When a social worker intervenes early enough to prevent a parent from harming their children, no one knows what disaster was averted. When a parole officer's close supervision prevents a parolee from reoffending, there's no dramatic arrest or trial, just someone completing their parole term without incident. When a hospital administrator's vigilance prevents a dangerous employee from being hired, there's no story to tell because nothing happened. The visible events are the failures, the tragedies that make the news and spark the investigations and lead to the reforms. The successful preventions remain invisible, unknown, unacknowledged. This creates a perverse incentive structure where systems are judged primarily on their failures rather than their successes, where professionals live in fear of the case that will go wrong rather than taking pride in the cases that go right. The reforms implemented after these tragedies followed a familiar pattern. Increased documentation requirements, additional layers of approval, more frequent check-ins and assessments, enhanced training programs, better information sharing protocols. All of these changes were necessary and overdue, but they also added to the workload of professionals who were already overwhelmed, created more bureaucracy in systems already drowning in paperwork, imposed new requirements without providing the additional funding and staffing needed to meet them. The result was that frontline workers were expected to do more with the same or fewer resources, to complete additional documentation while maintaining the same caseloads, to attend more training while still meeting all their existing obligations. Some rose to this challenge through sheer determination and sacrifice, working unpaid overtime and burning themselves out in the process. Others simply couldn't keep up, completed the required paperwork superficially without actually conducting the assessments and interventions the paperwork was meant to ensure. This is how systems decay even as they appear to improve on paper. Policies get created, protocols get implemented, training gets mandated, but without adequate resources to support these changes, they become performative rather than substantive. The documentation exists but doesn't reflect reality. The training is completed but doesn't change practice. The protocols are followed in form but not in function. The families who lost loved ones in these tragedies understood this dynamic better than anyone. They'd been told that systems existed to protect them, that professionals were monitoring concerning situations, that intervention would occur before tragedy struck. They'd trusted these assurances and discovered too late that the systems were overwhelmed, the professionals were overextended, the intervention would come too late if it came at all. Some of these families became advocates for reform, channeling their grief into activism, pushing for better funding and better policies and better accountability. They testified at legislative hearings, met with administrators, organized awareness campaigns, refusing to let their loved ones' deaths be reduced to statistics. Their advocacy led to real changes in some jurisdictions, actual funding increases and policy improvements that made genuine differences in how systems operated. But other families retreated into private grief, unable to engage with the systems that had failed them, wanting only to be left alone to process their loss. Both responses were valid and understandable. Not everyone has the emotional capacity to transform tragedy into advocacy, and no one should be expected to perform their grief in publicly productive ways. The perpetrators in these stories, the people who actually committed the violence, received the punishment that society had designated as appropriate for their crimes. Caleb Morrell was dead by his own hand, escaping earthly accountability, but also achieving the outcome he'd sought. Victor Hale, Darren Cole, Elias Crow, and Maribel Quince were all imprisoned for life, removed from society permanently, prevented from causing further harm. But punishment doesn't undo harm, and imprisonment doesn't restore what was lost. The families still wake up every morning to the absence of people they loved. The communities still carry the knowledge that someone among them had been a killer, that the neighbor or the nurse or the father had been capable of terrible violence. The professionals still replay the warning signs they saw, but didn't act on with sufficient urgency. This is the aftermath that persists long after the news coverage ends and the trials conclude and the perpetrators are locked away. The trauma ripples outward, affecting not just immediate victims and families, but entire communities, whole professional fields, the collective sense of safety that allows people to trust their neighbors and their institutions and their own judgment about who is dangerous and who is safe. The most insidious damage is to trust itself. After Elaine Foster's murder, how many people in Brookhaven Heights stopped opening their homes to people in need, decided that self-preservation had to take priority over compassion? After Maribel Quince's arrest, how many families struggled to trust the nurses caring for their elderly relatives, saw malice in every unexpected death, questioned whether their loved one's suffering was natural or inflicted? After Darren Cole's murders, how many parole boards became so risk-averse that they effectively ended meaningful parole review, keeping people imprisoned beyond what their crimes warranted because the political and personal cost of releasing someone who might reoffend became unbearable? After Caleb Morell's murder-suicide, how many social workers started filing removal petitions at the first sign of concerning parental behavior, erring so far toward intervention that they unnecessarily traumatized families who were struggling but not dangerous? These overcorrections are understandable, but they create their own harms. When systems become so cautious that they can't function, when trust is so eroded that cooperation becomes impossible, when fear drives decision-making rather than assessment and judgment, the cure can be as destructive as the disease. The goal should be calibrated response, interventions that are proportionate to actual risk, systems that can distinguish between concerning situations that need monitoring and dangerous situations that need immediate action. But achieving this calibration is extraordinarily difficult when resources are limited and stakes are high, and the cost of getting it wrong can be measured in bodies. The social worker deciding whether to remove children from a concerning home has to weigh the trauma of unnecessary removal against the possibility of leaving children in danger. The parole board evaluating a prisoner's release has to weigh the value of rehabilitation against the risk of recidivism. The hospital administrator reviewing a nurse's elevated patient mortality has to weigh the possibility of statistical anomaly against the horror of a healthcare serial killer. These are decisions that should be informed by data and expertise and careful deliberation, but they're often made under pressure with incomplete information by people who are tired and overworked and terrified of making the mistake that will end up as the next tragic story. The wonder isn't that systems sometimes fail, but that they function at all given the impossible demands placed on them. What becomes clear when examining these cases in aggregate is that prevention requires multiple components working together. Individual vigilance matters, people noticing concerning behavior and reporting it appropriately. Institutional processes matter, systems for receiving and investigating reports and acting on validated concerns. Resources matter, adequate staffing and funding to ensure that reports don't just get filed but actually get addressed. Coordination matters, different agencies and jurisdictions sharing information and working together rather than operating in isolation. But perhaps most importantly, culture matters. The willingness to take warnings seriously even when they're not definitive. The courage to intervene even when intervention feels uncomfortable or premature. The humility to acknowledge uncertainty while still making decisions. The acceptance that prevention sometimes requires disrupting someone's life based on incomplete evidence. That waiting for certainty means waiting until tragedy has already occurred. This is the hardest shift to achieve because it requires changing how people think and feel, not just what policies they follow. It requires social workers to trust their instincts even when documentation doesn't support intervention. It requires administrators to act on statistical anomalies even when individual cases seem explainable. It requires parole boards to weigh victim impact and offense severity more heavily than institutional behavior and performed remorse. These changes go against many people's instincts and training. Social workers are trained to respect family autonomy and to intervene only when absolutely necessary. Administrators are trained to avoid overreaction and to require solid evidence before making accusations. Parole boards are trained to assess rehabilitation objectively and to give people opportunities to prove they've changed. All of these approaches are valuable in many contexts, but they can be deadly when applied too rigidly to situations where danger is escalating. The families who lost loved ones in these tragedies don't want revenge as much as they want acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that their warnings were valid, that their concerns were reasonable, that they weren't being paranoid or overreactive when they sensed danger. Acknowledgement that the systems failed not because the warning signs were too subtle to detect, but because the systems weren't designed to respond to warning signs with sufficient speed and urgency. Some of this acknowledgement has come through lawsuits and settlements, though money is a poor substitute for accountability and institutional change. Some has come through policy reforms named after victims, though naming a policy after someone who died because the previous policy was inadequate doesn't bring much comfort. The most meaningful acknowledgement would be a genuine commitment to preventing the next tragedy, a willingness to invest in the resources and cultural changes needed to make prevention possible. But that commitment remains largely rhetorical. Politicians express sympathy after tragedies and promise reforms, then vote against the funding increases needed to implement those reforms. Administrators acknowledge systemic failures and vow to do better, then make the same resource allocation decisions that prioritized other concerns over prevention. Professionals attend training on recognizing warning signs, then return to caseloads that make meaningful follow-up on those warning signs impossible. This is not because people are callous or uncaring, but because systemic change is extraordinarily difficult when it requires sustained investment and attention rather than dramatic one-time gestures. It's easy to pass a new law in the wake of tragedy. It's hard to fund the implementation of that law year after year when other priorities compete for limited resources. It's easy to promise better oversight and coordination. It's hard to actually build the infrastructure and relationships needed to make that oversight and coordination functional. The stories you've heard today are not unique. Similar tragedies occur regularly across the country, different names and places, but the same underlying dynamics. Warning signs noticed, but not acted on. Systems that move too slowly. Resources spread too thin. Trust misplaced. Danger escalating while everyone waits for more certainty before intervening. What makes these particular stories noteworthy is not that they happened, but that they were preventable, that the information needed to prevent them existed in real time, that people saw and documented and reported concerning behavior, but the systems those reports fed into couldn't or wouldn't act with sufficient urgency. The gap between knowing something is wrong and doing something about it is where these tragedies occurred, in the space of delay and doubt and deference to process over outcome. Caleb Morell's children died in that gap, killed by a father whose concerning behavior had been reported to multiple professionals who each made reasonable decisions that collectively failed to protect them. Elaine Foster died in that gap, killed by someone she tried to help, whose violence had been predicted by his criminal history, but whose parole had been granted based on his performance of rehabilitation. The women Darren Cole killed died in that gap, murdered by someone who should have remained imprisoned but was released because the parole system couldn't distinguish between genuine change and skilled manipulation. The women Elias Crow killed died in that gap, not because anyone failed to notice warning signs, but because there were no warning signs to notice, because he'd never done anything that would have brought him to official attention before he started killing. The patients Maribel Quince killed died in that gap, murdered by someone everyone trusted, whose crimes were hidden in plain sight by a system that expected deaths and therefore didn't scrutinize them, that assumed healthcare workers were motivated by care rather than contemplating the possibility that some were motivated by power and control. Each gap was different, but the outcome was the same. People died who didn't have to die. Families were destroyed by losses that could have been prevented. Communities were traumatized by violence that was predictable, if not inevitable. And in the aftermath, everyone asked the same questions. How did this happen? Who was responsible? What warning signs were missed? Could this have been prevented? The answer to that last question is yes, in every case, with different interventions at different points. But prevention would have required resources and authority and cultural shifts that didn't exist, would have required people to act on incomplete information and uncertain hunches, would have required systems to move faster and speak more boldly than they were designed to do. This is the terrible truth about prevention. It requires disrupting people's lives based on possibility rather than certainty, requires intervening before tragedy occurs, and therefore never being able to prove that tragedy would have occurred without intervention. The social worker who removes children from a home based on concerning but not definitive evidence will be criticized if the concerns turn out to be overstated, blamed for traumatizing a family unnecessarily. But if she doesn't remove the children and they're harmed, she'll be blamed for not acting on obvious warning signs. The parole board that denies release to someone who seems to have rehabilitated will be accused of failing to give people second chances, of maintaining a purely punitive system that doesn't believe in redemption. But if they grant parole and the person reoffends, they'll be blamed for releasing a dangerous criminal despite clear evidence of their violence. There's no position that's safe, no decision that can't be second-guessed in hindsight, no way to balance the competing values of liberty and safety that will satisfy everyone. What professionals need is support for making difficult judgment calls, protection when they act in good faith on reasonable but incomplete evidence, resources adequate to the responsibilities they're being asked to shoulder. What they get instead is criticism when tragedies occur, symbolic policy changes that create more work without more support, and the same impossible expectations that made prevention difficult in the first place. The families affected by these tragedies understand this dynamic in ways that most people never will. They've lived through the aftermath, seen how systems respond to failure, participated in investigations and trials and reform efforts. Many of them are more sympathetic to the frontline workers who missed warning signs than the general public tends to be, recognizing that those workers were operating within broken systems that set them up to fail. But that sympathy coexists with anger at the systems themselves, at the policy makers and administrators and elected officials who maintain systems they know are inadequate, who express sympathy after tragedies but don't provide the resources needed to prevent the next one. This anger is justified and important, represents the voices of people who've paid the ultimate price for systemic dysfunction and therefore have moral authority to demand change. Some of that change has occurred, incrementally and unevenly. Some jurisdictions have increased funding for social services and upgraded their data systems and implemented better protocols for interagency communication. Some parole boards have revised their assessment methods to place more weight on offense severity and victim impact. Some healthcare facilities have implemented statistical monitoring to identify patterns that might indicate dangerous employees. But these improvements are far from universal and far from sufficient. Many jurisdictions continue to operate with the same resource constraints and systemic problems that enabled the tragedies described in these stories. The warning signs continue to be noticed and documented and filed away. The systems continue to move slowly, speak cautiously, wait for certainty that comes too late. The gaps between knowledge and action continue to exist, continue to widen, continue to be the spaces where preventable tragedies occur. This is not a problem that will be solved by individual stories or individual reforms. It's a structural problem that requires sustained commitment to funding and cultural change, requires society to prioritize prevention even though prevention is invisible and therefore politically unrewarding, requires accepting that some interventions will turn out to be unnecessary, but that unnecessary intervention is preferable to necessary intervention that comes too late. The people in these stories who noticed warning signs and tried to act on them did what they could within the constraints they faced. The school counselors and teachers who filed reports on Caleb Morrell. The reentry counselor who sensed something wrong in his conversation with Elaine Foster. The detective who pushed for a warrant to search Darren Cole's apartment based on instinct rather than concrete evidence. The administrator who flagged Maribel Quince's elevated patient mortality. These people were doing their jobs well, better than well, going beyond minimum requirements to notice and document and act on concerning patterns. They weren't the problem. The problem was that their efforts were isolated, operating within systems that weren't designed to support and amplify individual vigilance, that couldn't move quickly enough to prevent danger from escalating into tragedy. What would have been required to prevent these specific tragedies? For Caleb Morrell's children, a system that synthesized reports from school and social services into a unified assessment, that recognized the pattern of concerning behavior across multiple contexts, that had authority to mandate intensive intervention rather than just offering voluntary services. A system with small enough caseloads that social workers could conduct meaningful follow-up rather than rushing through home visits before moving on to the next crisis. For Elaine Foster, a parole system that didn't rely primarily on institutional behavior to assess risk, that recognized the limitations of using time served in program completion as proxies for genuine change, that maintained intensive supervision throughout the critical reintegration period rather than reducing oversight based on early compliance. A system that believed victims' families when they said the person was still dangerous despite performing rehabilitation convincingly. For the women Darren Cole killed, a parole system even more fundamentally different, one that might not have released him at all, that might have recognized that someone who murders an intimate partner over a breakup has demonstrated a psychology that's unlikely to change regardless of years served or programs completed. A system that prioritized protecting potential future victims over giving the perpetrator a second chance to prove he'd changed. For the women Elias Crow killed, the interventions needed would have been entirely different because there were no warning signs in his official record. Prevention would have required either catching him after his first murder before he could commit others, which would have meant better data sharing and pattern recognition across jurisdictions, or somehow identifying and intervening with him before he killed anyone, which would have required surveillance and thought policing that most people would find unacceptable in a free society. For the patients Maribel Quince killed, prevention would have required statistical monitoring of healthcare outcomes that most facilities don't conduct, would have required acting on elevated mortality rates even when individual deaths seemed explainable, would have required believing that a warm and competent nurse could also be a serial killer despite the cognitive dissonance that belief creates. None of these interventions were impossible. All of them were difficult, expensive, uncomfortable, requiring resources and authority and willingness to act that the existing systems lacked. This is why prevention failed, not because prevention was impossible, but because it was hard and the systems weren't equipped to do hard things consistently and well. The question facing society now is whether these tragedies will catalyze genuine change or will simply be absorbed into the ongoing stream of terrible stories that generate temporary outrage before being forgotten. History suggests the latter is more likely, that most people will read or hear about these cases and feel brief sadness or anger before moving on with their lives, that the systemic changes needed to prevent similar tragedies won't occur because they require sustained attention and resources that competing priorities will crowd out. But history isn't destiny, and change is possible if enough people demand it. If the families of victims and the professionals who tried to prevent these tragedies and the citizens who recognize that anyone could be the next victim join together to insist on something better. Change requires acknowledging that the current systems are fundamentally inadequate, that incremental reforms aren't sufficient, that genuine prevention requires genuine investment. It requires elected officials to fund social services adequately, even though prevention doesn't generate the dramatic success stories that make for good campaign material. It requires administrators to prioritize safety over budget concerns, even when that means spending money on interventions that might turn out to be unnecessary. It requires professionals to trust their judgment and act on incomplete information, even when that means sometimes being wrong and facing criticism for overreacting. It requires all of us to accept that perfect safety is impossible, but that much better safety is achievable if we're willing to pay for it in money and attention and occasional inconvenience. It requires recognizing that the person sitting next to you on the bus or caring for your elderly parent or going through a difficult divorce in the house down the street might be someone who poses danger to themselves or others, and that early intervention could prevent tragedy. This recognition doesn't mean living in constant fear or suspicion, doesn't mean reporting every neighbor who seems a bit off or every coworker who's having a bad day. It means calibrating our responses appropriately, taking concerns seriously without overreacting, documenting and reporting genuine warning signs, while understanding that most concerning behavior doesn't escalate into violence. It means supporting the professionals who do this calibration as their daily work, who make dozens of judgment calls every week about which situations need intensive intervention and which need monitoring and which are probably fine. It means understanding that they won't always get it right, that some children will be unnecessarily removed from homes, and some parolees will be unnecessarily restricted, and some employees will be unnecessarily investigated, and that these overcorrections are the price of preventing worse outcomes. Most importantly, it means accepting that prevention is often invisible and therefore difficult to celebrate or even to recognize. When a social worker's intervention prevents a parent from harming their children, there's no dramatic rescue to point to, just a family that stayed together and stayed safe. When a parole officer's close supervision prevents a parolee from reoffending, there's no arrest or conviction to mark the success, just someone who completed parole without incident. When a hospital administrator's vigilance prevents a dangerous employee from being hired, there's no story to tell because nothing happened. These invisible preventions are the goal, the outcome we should be working toward, but they're difficult to value and fund and celebrate because they exist only as absence, as tragedies that didn't occur, as violence that never happened because someone intervened before it could. The families who lost loved ones in the tragedies described in these stories would give anything for that kind of invisible prevention, for the intervention that would have happened before tragedy struck, for the warning signs to have been taken seriously enough that action occurred in time. They carry their losses every day, wake up to absence, navigate a world where their loved one should be but isn't, and know that it didn't have to be this way. Caleb Morell's ex-wife lives with the knowledge that her children died while she was living in another state, believing they were being adequately supervised, trusting that the systems designed to protect children were actually protecting hers. She'd expressed concerns, filed for emergency custody modification, done everything a mother could do within the legal framework available to her, and it wasn't enough because the framework itself was inadequate. Marcus Lowell lives alone in a new city, building a new life, unable to return to the house where Elaine died or to the work they'd done together helping people in need. He believes still in the values that motivated them to open their home to Victor Hale, believes people deserve second chances and support during difficult transitions, but he also knows that kindness without caution can be fatal, that not everyone who appears to need help is safe to help. Amy's mother, the woman whose daughter Darren Cole murdered before his first imprisonment, lives with the vindication of being right about his danger and the rage of not being believed soon enough. She told the parole board exactly what would happen if they released him, had been dismissed as an over-emotional victim unable to see beyond her own grief, had been proven horrifically correct when other women died. She'll never know if her continued advocacy might have prevented those deaths, or if the system was so committed to believing in rehabilitation that no amount of warning would have changed their decision. The families of the women Elias Crow killed live with the randomness of their losses, the knowledge that their daughters and sisters and mothers were killed for no reason beyond being in the wrong place at the wrong time, that nothing they could have done differently would have protected them because the danger was invisible until it materialized. This randomness is in some ways harder to bear than targeted violence because it offers no possibility of alternate outcomes, no what-if scenarios that might have led to safety. The families of Maribel Quince's victims live with the betrayal of trust, the knowledge that they'd placed their loved ones in what they believed was professional care, and that care had actually been murder. Some of them had thanked Maribel for her attention to their relatives, had invited her to funerals, had remembered her in their wills. The violation goes beyond the act of killing to encompass all the lies and manipulations that surrounded it, the performance of compassion that masked contempt. These families carry their losses in different ways, some through activism and advocacy, some through private grief, some through faith or therapy or immersion in work. There's no right way to survive this kind of loss, no timeline for healing, no point at which the absence stops aching. They've learned to live with it because they have no choice, have built lives around the hole where their loved one used to be, have found ways to continue even though part of them remained frozen in the moment they received the news. And they're not alone. Every year, thousands of families join them. Families who lose loved ones to violence that was preventable, that was preceded by warning signs that were noticed but not acted on with sufficient urgency. These families form an unwanted community, connected by the common experience of loving someone who died because systems failed, bound together by grief and anger and the determination that no other family should have to endure what they've endured. Some of these families find each other through victim advocacy organizations, support groups, online communities. They share resources and coping strategies, testify together at legislative hearings, organize awareness campaigns. Their collective voice carries weight that individual voices don't, represents a constituency that elected officials and administrators can't easily dismiss or ignore. But many families remain isolated in their grief, lack the energy or inclination to join organized advocacy, want only to be left alone to process their loss in private. Both responses are valid. Not everyone is called to transform their tragedy into activism, and those who choose private grief deserve the same respect and support as those who choose public advocacy. What all these families share, regardless of how they choose to navigate their loss, is the knowledge that prevention was possible, that the information needed to intervene existed before tragedy struck, that the warning signs were there for anyone who was looking and willing to act. This knowledge doesn't provide comfort, but it does provide clarity, strips away the possibility of believing their loved one's death was unavoidable, forces confrontation with the reality that systems chose process over protection, chose caution over action, chose to wait for certainty that came too late. The professionals who were involved in these cases carry their own burden of knowledge, their own awareness of the moments when different decisions might have led to different outcomes. Some of them have left their fields entirely, unable to continue in roles where they'll always be haunted by the case that got away, where they'll always be wondering whether the current case might be the next tragedy. Others have stayed in their roles but changed their approach, become more aggressive in their interventions, more willing to act on incomplete information, more comfortable with the possibility of being wrong if being wrong means erring on the side of safety. Both responses are understandable, and both create their own problems. The field loses experienced professionals who leave after traumatic cases, losing their institutional knowledge and their hard-won expertise. The professionals who stay but become overly cautious create different kinds of harm through unnecessary interventions, families disrupted, and lives derailed by investigations that turn out to be unwarranted. The goal should be to support professionals in making calibrated judgments, to create systems that allow for action based on reasonable concern without requiring absolute certainty, to protect professionals who act in good faith even when their interventions turn out to be unnecessary. But achieving this goal requires cultural change that's extraordinarily difficult to implement. Requires shifting from a reactive mindset that punishes failure to a proactive mindset that supports decision-making under uncertainty. It requires accepting that professionals will sometimes be wrong, that some children will be removed from homes unnecessarily, that some parolees will be supervised more intensively than their risk level warrants, that some employees will be investigated based on statistical anomalies that turn out to be coincidence. These false positives are the price of prevention, the necessary cost of catching the true positives before they escalate into tragedy. But American culture, particularly in the current political and legal environment, is deeply uncomfortable with false positives, views them as rights violations and government overreach and examples of systems run amok. This discomfort is understandable and in many contexts appropriate, represents important protection against authoritarian excess and arbitrary state power. But when applied too rigidly to contexts where prevention requires early intervention, this discomfort becomes an obstacle to safety, requires waiting for harm to occur before action is justified. The families who've lost loved ones to preventable violence understand this tension in visceral ways that most people never will. They've lived the consequences of systems that waited too long, that required too much proof, that prioritized individual rights and procedural correctness over collective safety. They don't necessarily advocate for abandoning those protections entirely, but they do insist that the balance has tilted too far toward caution, that the cost of false positives needs to be weighed against the cost of false negatives, that preventing tragedy should take priority over avoiding inconvenience. This is a difficult argument to make politically because the people harmed by false positives are visible and vocal, while the people saved by prevention are invisible and often unaware that they were ever in danger. The family whose children are removed from their home based on a concern that turns out to be overstated will tell their story publicly, will generate sympathy and outrage, will serve as evidence of government overreach. The family whose children are protected from harm through early intervention will never know what was prevented, will have no story to tell because the tragedy didn't occur. This asymmetry makes it very difficult to build political support for prevention-focused policies, makes it easy for critics to point to costs and harms while supporters struggle to demonstrate benefits that exist only as absence. The solution isn't to ignore the real harms caused by unnecessary intervention, but to develop better assessment tools and more nuanced protocols that can distinguish between situations that need intensive intervention and situations that need monitoring or support. This development requires investment in research and training, requires piloting new approaches and evaluating their effectiveness, requires learning from both successes and failures to continually refine practice. It requires treating prevention as a serious field of study and practice rather than as an afterthought to crisis response, requires valuing the work of identifying and mitigating risks before they escalate into emergencies. Some jurisdictions have made this investment, have developed innovative approaches to threat assessment and early intervention, have demonstrated that prevention is possible when adequately resourced and properly implemented. But these successes remain isolated examples rather than standard practice, haven't been scaled up or replicated broadly, haven't fundamentally changed how most systems operate. The question is whether the tragedies described in these stories will contribute to broader change, or will simply be absorbed into the ongoing accumulation of preventable harm that society has learned to accept as inevitable. The answer depends partly on whether these stories are told in ways that generate sustained attention rather than brief outrage, that focus on systemic causes rather than individual villains, that point toward concrete reforms rather than vague calls for someone to do something. It depends on whether the families affected by these tragedies continue to advocate for change even as their acute grief softens into chronic loss, whether they can sustain their activism over years and decades rather than just the immediate aftermath. It depends on whether professionals who've seen these failures firsthand are willing to speak publicly about systemic problems, even when doing so might jeopardize their careers or relationships with colleagues and supervisors. It depends on whether elected officials are willing to fund prevention, even though prevention doesn't generate the dramatic results that make for compelling campaign materials, even though the benefits won't be visible within an election cycle, even though supporting prevention-focused policies might expose them to criticism from those who view any expansion of government intervention with suspicion. Most fundamentally, it depends on whether ordinary citizens are willing to accept that prevention requires investment and occasionally requires intervention based on incomplete certainty, that the choice isn't between perfect safety and perfect liberty, but between different allocations of risk and different distributions of harm. It depends on whether we're willing to pay higher taxes to fund adequate social services, to accept occasional unnecessary investigations if they prevent worse outcomes, to support professionals who make difficult judgment calls even when those calls sometimes turn out to be wrong. These are not questions with easy answers, and reasonable people can disagree about where the right balance lies. But what's not reasonable is to continue operating systems that everyone acknowledges are inadequate, that generate preventable tragedies on a regular basis, that leave frontline professionals overwhelmed and families vulnerable and communities traumatized. What's not reasonable is to express sympathy after each tragedy while refusing to provide the resources and authority needed to prevent the next one. The stories you've heard today represent 5 different failure modes, 5 different ways that prevention breaks down despite warning signs being present. But they also represent 5 opportunities for learning and improvement, 5 cases that illuminate what needs to change if we're serious about preventing rather than just reacting to violence. The question is whether we'll seize those opportunities or whether these tragedies will simply become more data points in an ever-growing catalog of preventable harm. The children Caleb Morrell killed deserved a system that moved faster, that synthesized information across agencies, that had authority to intervene based on pattern rather than waiting for crisis. Elaine Foster deserved a parole system that didn't release violent offenders based primarily on their ability to perform rehabilitation, that maintained intensive supervision during the critical reintegration period. The women Darren Cole killed deserved a system that believed victims' families when they said someone was still dangerous, that weighted the severity of the original crime more heavily than institutional behavior. The women Elias Crow killed deserved better data sharing across jurisdictions, faster pattern recognition, more intensive investigation of disappearances. The patients Maribel Quince killed deserved statistical monitoring of healthcare outcomes, protocols that could identify dangerous employees before body counts became undeniable. All of these people deserved systems that prioritized their safety over bureaucratic convenience, that acted on warning signs rather than waiting for certainty, that understood that the cost of unnecessary intervention is almost always less than the cost of necessary intervention that comes too late. They deserved better than they got, and so do we all, because any of us could be the next victim of preventable violence, the next person killed by someone whose warning signs were noticed but not acted on, the next family navigating grief while investigators explain all the reasons why the systems that were supposed to protect us couldn't or didn't. We deserve systems that work, that prevent rather than just respond, that take warnings seriously enough to act before tragedy strikes. Whether we'll get those systems depends on choices we make collectively about resource allocation and risk tolerance and the balance between individual rights and collective safety. It depends on whether we're willing to invest in prevention even though prevention is invisible, to support professionals who make difficult judgment calls, to accept occasional unnecessary intervention as the price of preventing worse outcomes. The most dangerous moment isn't when violence begins. It's when warnings are dismissed as inconvenience, when concerns are filed away as insufficient for action, when everyone knows something is wrong, but no one knows quite what to do about it, so nothing gets done. That's when preventable tragedies become inevitable, when the gap between knowledge and action widens into a chasm that people fall through to their deaths. Caleb Morell's children fell through that gap. Elaine Foster fell through it. The women Darren Cole killed, the women Elias Crow killed, the patients Maribel Quince murdered, all of them fell through that same gap between knowing and doing, between concern and intervention, between warning and action. They fell because systems were too slow, too cautious, too underfunded, too fragmented to catch them in time. Their deaths were not inevitable. They were not random misfortunes or acts of God or tragedies that no one could have predicted. They were the predictable outcomes of systems that prioritize process over protection, that require certainty before allowing intervention, that move at bureaucratic speed while danger escalates at human speed. They were preventable and they weren't prevented, and that's the tragedy within the tragedy, the knowledge that it didn't have to be this way. The families who love these victims live with that knowledge every day, carry it as a weight that never lightens, face it every morning when they wake to absence. They know their loved ones should still be alive, know that different decisions at different moments might have prevented their deaths, know that the warning signs were there for anyone willing to look and willing to act. And they know that somewhere right now, in some jurisdiction, some professional is noticing warning signs in a current case, is documenting concerning behavior, is filing a report that will go into a queue with hundreds of other reports, is waiting for someone with authority and time and resources to act on that report before it's too late. They know that the same dynamics that failed their loved ones are failing someone else right now, that another family is heading toward the same grief they've already experienced, that prevention is possible but not occurring because the systems remain fundamentally unchanged. This is the knowledge that drives some of them to advocacy, that keeps them testifying at hearings and organizing awareness campaigns and pushing for reforms even when that work is exhausting and emotionally devastating. They do it because they can't bear the thought of another family joining their unwanted community, can't accept that their loved one's death won't at least contribute to preventing the next death, can't live with themselves if they have the knowledge and experience to push for change but choose comfortable silence instead. Others carry the same knowledge more quietly, process it privately, honor their loved ones through memory rather than activism. They're no less committed to prevention, but they express that commitment differently, through how they raise their children or do their work or live their lives. Both approaches are valid and valuable, and the families who choose each path deserve support and respect. What all of them deserve, what we all deserve, is a society that takes prevention seriously enough to fund it adequately, that values the invisible work of identifying and mitigating risks before they escalate, that supports professionals who make difficult judgment calls under uncertain conditions, that accepts that some unnecessary interventions are the price of preventing necessary ones from coming too late. We deserve systems that move faster than danger escalates, that synthesize information across agencies and jurisdictions, that act on patterns rather than waiting for crises, that prioritize safety over procedural correctness when those values conflict. We deserve systems that believe people when they say they're concerned, that investigate those concerns thoroughly, that intervene early enough to prevent rather than just react to harm. These systems don't exist in most places, but they could. The knowledge of how to build them exists. The examples of jurisdictions that have done it successfully exist. The research documenting what works and what doesn't exist. What's missing is the sustained political will to fund implementation, the cultural shift to accept early intervention based on reasonable concern, the willingness to prioritize prevention even though its benefits are invisible and its costs are immediate. Building that will and achieving that shift requires stories like the ones you've heard today, stories that illustrate the human cost of inadequate prevention, that connect individual tragedies to systemic causes, that point toward concrete reforms rather than vague aspirations. It requires keeping these stories alive in public consciousness long enough for them to generate sustained pressure for change rather than brief outrage that dissipates when the next news cycle begins. It requires all of us to engage with these stories not as entertainment or as background noise for sleep, but as urgent warnings about systems that affect all of our lives, that could fail any of us at any time, that are failing someone right now while we're comfortable in our homes believing ourselves safe. It requires recognizing that the line between the victims in these stories and the rest of us is thinner than we'd like to believe, that any of us could be the next person killed by someone whose warning signs were noticed but not acted on. If you've stayed with these stories to the end, if you've allowed them to affect you rather than just washing over you, then you have a choice to make. You can treat them as entertainment consumed and forgotten, or you can let them change how you think about prevention and intervention and the responsibility we have to act on warning signs, even when action is uncomfortable or inconvenient. You can contact your elected officials and demand adequate funding for social services, for mental health care, for parole supervision, for all the systems that are supposed to prevent tragedy but can't function properly without resources. You can support professionals in these fields, recognize the impossible positions they occupy, advocate for better working conditions and smaller caseloads and more authority to intervene based on reasonable concern. You can take warning signs seriously in your own life and your own community. Report concerning behavior rather than assuming someone else will handle it. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong even if you can't articulate exactly what's concerning you. You can be the person who acts instead of the person who looks back afterward and wishes they'd acted, who files the report or makes the call, or has the uncomfortable conversation that might prevent the next tragedy. Or you can do nothing, can treat these stories as isolated incidents rather than symptoms of systemic problems, can assume that prevention is someone else's responsibility and someone else's problem. That's a choice too, and it's one that many people make because activism is hard and sustained engagement is exhausting, and it's easier to believe that systems are functioning adequately than to confront the reality of their inadequacy. But that choice has consequences, contributes to the continuation of systems that generate preventable tragedies, maintains the gap between knowledge and action where people fall to their deaths. And when the next tragedy occurs, when the next family joins the community of those who've lost loved ones to preventable violence, those who chose comfortable silence will bear some responsibility for the systems that made that tragedy possible. The warnings are there. They've always been there. The question isn't whether we can see them, but whether we're willing to act on them with sufficient urgency, whether we value prevention enough to invest in it adequately, whether we'll choose safety over convenience when those values conflict. The answer to that question will determine how many more families join the ranks of those grieving preventable losses, how many more victims die while everyone waits for certainty that comes too late. If these stories have affected you, if they've made you angry or sad or determined that things should be different, then let that response move you to action rather than just fading into background resignation. Subscribe to this channel to stay informed about true crime stories that illuminate systemic problems. Like this video to help it reach others who need to understand these issues. Leave a comment sharing which story affected you most and what you think should change to prevent similar tragedies. Your engagement matters because it extends the reach of these stories, keeps them in public consciousness, contributes to the sustained pressure needed for genuine reform. The families who've lost loved ones to preventable violence need allies in their fight for change, need people who will join them in demanding better systems, need the collective voice that can't be ignored or dismissed as easily as individual voices. The most dangerous moment isn't when violence begins. It's when warnings are dismissed as inconvenience, filed away as insufficient for action, noticed but not acted on because intervention feels uncomfortable or premature. That's when preventable tragedies become inevitable, when the gap between knowledge and action opens wide enough for people to fall through to their deaths. Close that gap. Act on warnings. Demand better systems. Prevent the next tragedy instead of grieving it afterward. The choice is ours, individually and collectively, and people's lives depend on the choice we make.